You heard from the reading from Exodus, we're going to be looking at the beginning of the life of one of the central figures in the Bible, the man Moses. Now, if you know anything about Moses, you know that he becomes the central figure in the liberation of the people of God, the Hebrews. And he is part of this incredible drama where he goes and he confronts the Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh says, "No, I'm not going to do that." And then begins this battle basically between God and Pharaoh. And you all know what happens when we fight with God, right? You heard the saying, your arms are too short to box with God. Amen. Now, you might know that Moses came and was used by God to be the liberator during a very dark time in the history of the Hebrew people, a time when they are being brutally enslaved and mistreated. And we heard a little bit about how poorly the Egyptians were treating the Hebrews and how relentless the demands that they were making upon them were. And through Moses, God speaks to Pharaoh and demands that Pharaoh let the people go. And then when Pharaoh refuses to do so, this begins a whole series of incredible events and miracles that end with God parting the Red Sea so that the Hebrews can walk across on dry land and escape the pursuing armies of the Pharaoh as they cross over into the Promised Land. And we know, of course, that the story of Moses is not just the story of Moses, it's also the story of God and how God used Moses to directly intervene into the affairs of history in defense of a powerless, enslaved group of people known as the Hebrews. And in the story of Moses, we see a God who is directly involved in a very powerful way, manipulating nature and doing all sorts of miraculous things through Moses to all with the goal of helping the Hebrews escape from slavery. God is a major player, of course, in this passage or these events. And so truly they could say later on with the psalmist, if it had not been for the Lord who was on our side, if it had not been for the Lord who was on our side, we wouldn't be here today. That's true, isn't it? But sometimes we see God directly intervening into human affairs for His purposes. Not always. And in fact, actually, the earlier part of this story, the part that we're looking at today, is a little bit different in the sense that God isn't as seemingly directly involved, right? It's more of a human story. It's a story that depends on a handful of women making some decisions and God using that to save a nation. See, what you got to understand is that as powerful as God acted in Moses' time to deliver the people through direct action, there wouldn't have been an exodus. There wouldn't have been anyone to leave slavery if these women hadn't done what they did. And so the story of Moses is captivating to us. And so captivating that we make movies about it and we teach it to our children because it's such a powerful story. But as we look at the beginning of Moses' life, it is a little bit different, isn't it? Did you notice that there wasn't much talk about God in this morning's lesson? We went halfway through it. It was a pretty long lesson. We went halfway through it before the name of God is even mentioned. And so long before all the plagues and storms and natural disasters that God works through Moses, God is active in this part, but in a much quieter, less spectacular way. And instead of God's direct action, everything that happens depends upon what these 5 women, these gutsy women, decide to do to resist the encroaching evil perpetrated by the Pharaoh. And that's how the nation gets saved. So these women are incredibly important to the life of Moses and to the history of the Hebrew people, aren't they? Here was the scene, as we've already talked about, after many generations of living as foreigners in the land of Egypt, a new king, a new Pharaoh takes over, far less inclined to see the presence of the Hebrew neighbors. In fact, he's afraid of them, and because he saw that their numbers were increasing to the point where there was the potential that they would outnumber the Egyptians, he says, I've got to do something about this. We've heard this rhetoric a little bit recently, haven't we? You hear white folks say, gosh, we may become the minority in our own country. Well, it wasn't their country. We better be afraid. So the status of the Hebrews, because of the fear that is fomented by the Pharaoh, the status of the Hebrew quickly deteriorates from welcome guests to feared aliens and oppressed slaves. Like I said, if this sounds familiar, it should. It's tempting for political leaders, for new leaders, to use as a political strategy fear and division. It's not unusual for new leaders, whether they be Egyptian pharaohs or Nazi Hitlers or even a president, to attempt to solidify their power by singling out a relatively weak minority or outsider group and calling them the enemy. Playing off the fear of the other can be a powerful source of gathering power and of building a twisted sort of unity. And that was what Pharaoh was trying to do in our lesson, to recruit even his fellow Egyptians, the general populace, in fearing their Hebrew neighbors so much that they'd be willing to throw babies into the river. God have mercy. He comes up with this horrible scheme to terrorize the Hebrews by having all of their newborn male children killed to fulfill this terrible plan. He first tries to recruit the midwives, who are, of course, there when the Hebrew mothers are giving birth. Now here's something to notice. Pharaoh has a lot of power, but he doesn't have a whole lot of smarts. Thank God. And I don't know if you have ever noticed this in history, that sometimes powerful people just aren't very bright. Right? Just because you're powerful doesn't mean you got it all going on. And Pharaoh was no exception to that. He decides that the way to solve his problem is to kill all the baby boys. And he gets so obsessed about the baby boys that he forgets to worry about the women. And the women is what you really got to be worried about, right? Amen?
Absolutely.
Yeah, he forgot all about the women. And that was the problem with what he had. And the other thing that's kind of dumb about it, you kill the baby boys, and you don't kill the people who are still going to give birth to more baby boys. You know what I'm saying? Ain't very smart. And thank God some of our tyrants are not very smart. There's a fatal flaw typically in their thinking, So thankfully, Pharaoh's pretty stupid. He goes to the midwives, and of course, even though the Hebrews and the Pharaohs had been living together for so many decades, still, for some reason, they had to have Hebrew midwives for the Egyptian for the Hebrew mothers, right? And so, of course, what does he expect these Hebrew midwives to do? Kill all the baby boys of your people. They find a way, they kind of a sneaky way. Remember, we were talking about this. They said, well, we're not able to do what you ask us to do, O Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women, you don't know this about them, but they give birth really fast. And by the time we get there, the baby's already out. Already in the mama's arms. I can't do anything with that. Well, like I said, I'm not sure that's completely true. I think they were just trying to save some of the babies. And I would think we would all do the same. I'd call that a fib rather than a lie. You understand what I'm saying? And so that's not working, right? And so then he says, well, okay, all of you, everybody that you see, if you see a Hebrew baby boy, and I don't know how they kind of figured all this out. I mean, did they have to peek under their diapers or what? I don't know. But if you see a baby boy of the Hebrews, pitch him in the river. And little did he know that a little while after he said that, there was going to be a situation where a Hebrew woman, out of desperation, put a little baby boy into a little basket and put some touch and tar on it and sent it down the river because she didn't know what else to do. And it was going to be so pitiful and so pathetic that even when the Pharaoh's daughter, the Egyptian Pharaoh, found the Hebrew baby, and she knew what she was supposed to do with that baby, and he was already in the river, and all she had to do was flip that little boat over. But she says, no, she took pity. And even the Pharaoh's daughter colluded with those midwives. See, it was a cross-cultural collusion. You hear what I'm saying? Between Hebrew and Egyptians against the evil of the Pharaoh, resisting what they were called to do, that they knew was wrong. Now, like I said, this is a timely word for our day. Because the spirit of Pharaoh is still alive in our midst, is it not? Amen? Human dignity is still under assault, as recent news reminds us. We've read in the news about how many millions of Americans, their health care, access to insurance and access to health care is being put at risk. And we've seen hatred and bigotry marching in our streets, becoming emboldened and normalized by some of our leaders. Groups who are already serving in our military and who are willing to do so are singled out for rejection, their identities and courage dismissed in an effort to secure points in culture wars. Families and neighbors and yes, congregations fear being torn apart by ICE agents and policies. And in the meantime, leaders of our churches, some of them are telling us that Christians should not dare to resist these political leaders who have been supposedly set in by God himself. Some of them here are saying that to go against these leaders is to go against God. Thank God those Hebrew midwives weren't listening to those preachers. Amen. Thank God even Pharaoh's daughter was not afraid to defy her father when he was using hatred driven by fear to divide people and to kill. See, sometimes in the face of evil, we need to resist. Sometimes that is what it means to be a follower of Jesus. You know, I know that the Methodists aren't the only ones that when we have a baptism, you ever notice this? We ask people to say yes to this promise. Do you promise to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves? See, that's the spirit of the midwives. Do you promise to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves? Will you renew that promise that you made or was made for you in your baptism today? Can I get a yes from you all?
Yes.
Will you? You know, it might seem we are working against big forces. It might seem like we are just like little old midwives, nobodies in the face of forces way beyond our capacity to have an impact. But you know what? It was those folks who were used to save a nation. Who knows, but you and I, our little church, you and me, we might be used to, in some small way, save a nation. We've got to trust and obey, for there's no other way. Some of you may have heard this story about an old man who used to go to the ocean to do his writing, and he had a habit of walking on the beach every morning before he began his work. And one morning he was walking along the shore after a big storm had passed, and he found the vast beach littered with starfish. You all know what starfish are? And as the storm had receded and as the tide had gone back, the starfish were stranded on the beach. And when you are a starfish and you get stranded on the beach and the sun starts to shine, well, you're going to get ex-starfish before too long. And there were starfish all over the beach. And off in the distance, the old man noticed a small boy approaching. And as the boy walked, he paused every so often, and as he drew closer, the man could see that he was occasionally bending down to pick up an object and throw it into the sea. And the boy came even closer, and the man called out, "Good morning. May I ask what it is that you are doing?" And the young boy paused. He looked up and he replied, "I'm throwing starfish into the ocean. The storm has washed them up onto the beach, and they can't return to the sea by themselves. And when the sun gets high, they will die unless I throw them back into the water." The old man replied, "But there must be tens of thousands of starfish on this beach. Do you think you can really make a difference doing this?" The little boy looked at him, and he picked up another starfish, and he threw it out into the ocean, and he said, "Well, it made a difference for that one." See, what it means to be a follower of Jesus in this day and time in which we are living, it means to stem the tide as the beach at the beach. It means to go out on the beach, even in the midst of the storms, and throw starfish back in. It means to be midwives, helping to give birth to the kingdom of God. Remember that promise you just made again? To resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present yourself. You made that promise not just to me and to each other, but you made it to God. So how about it? How about becoming like one of those midwives? This week, who will you give life to? Who will you rescue? What evil will you persistently resist? Who knows? God might use you to save a nation. Amen.